Instead of meeting it with a sense of, oh dear God, I'm dying, it was, wow, I think I'm dying. This is extraordinary. It seems like a funny thing to say out loud. I felt lucky. I felt delighted. I felt so fascinated by the way this was already unfolding that it felt like a gift to know that it was going to unfold for a little while. My name is Jonathan Van Valin. I'm coming to you today from southern India. It's not my hometown. My hometown is Seattle, Washington. And it was quite a few years ago there that as a 29-year-old, I encountered a surgical procedure that was deemed really the only solution possible, in my case, for a sleep apnea issue, and underwent a surgery. It removes a great deal of tissue from the back of one's throat, the soft palate, removed a few chips of bone even from the skull behind my nose. This is a surgery that's not often done these days. It's known for being exceptionally painful to recover from, which is one of a handful of reasons why it's often considered the last option for people that have a sleep apnea issue. But it was deemed the right choice for me. I don't doubt that it was. And this is not some sort of operating table kind of near-death experience. In fact, the surgery went very well. I had been in recovery in the hospital for 4 days and was released into the care of my father. And again, I'm not a kid. I'm 29 years old, but he wanted to watch over me in my recovery, which was an act of love I will always remember him for. And we did not have a perfect relationship by any means, but we'd come to a very pleasant detente in during these years, and I was grateful to have his support. He took me out to the family farmhouse 2 hours away from the hospital, and there was very little he could do in any way. I pretty much was just propped up. I could stare out windows all I wanted. And he was going to spend his time doing house chores and farm chores and things like that, as I pretty much stared out windows and simply tried to heal up. I mentioned that this is extremely painful in recovery. You'll see why that's important in a few moments. But the reason for it is that when you remove all that tissue from that part of your body, it's an extraordinarily nerve-rich part of your body. Every nerve in your body comes up through here, and the problem is that you have to continue to use this part of your body as well. You have to breathe and to swallow and things like that. And so before these doctors did the surgery, they had actually tried to warn me against it. Again, they try not to do the surgery at all these days for the most part. But what they said was basically, Jonathan, you're going to have to experience what it's like to break your leg and then have to walk on it for days and days. And that was very apt. And so the days following the surgery were just it's hard to explain, but it's just blackout, mind-numbing, mind-bending levels of pain. And there's really nothing you can do about it, not much really. There was some garden variety pharmacological solutions offered. They did very little. On about the third day of my father's care, what I experienced is what I can best describe very simply as an inner click. And as in the instant of that inner click, that it was immediately clear that my body was beginning to shut down. The life force in it was beginning to drain away. And in that moment of that click, there were 3 experiences and sort of revelations that flooded in. They flooded in simultaneously. It's impossible to describe them without doing it sequentially, but it was really quite instantaneous. And I just mentioned something about there being some pain management. And one of the things that was remarkable about the moment of that click was that it was felt and experienced on an inner level that was stunningly clear. and clear in a way that was completely apart from any kind of narcotic effect. It's a little difficult to describe that, but completely apart from any narcotic effect. The first of those recognitions, experiences, revelations that flooded in this moment was a very clear recognition simply that I was not my body, and that manifested in the way that it was very clear that this body was beginning to lose its life force. It was draining away, but that there was an aware consciousness, an aware beingness, an awareness that was crystal clear and that was itself not affected in any way. The observing consciousness that recognized that the body was beginning to die was itself totally unchanged. It was not dying. And so it was clearly seen then that the body and that observing aware consciousness seemed to be two different things. In the moment of that recognition, that was an absolute stunning freedom. Because what it really meant in that moment for me was that the pain in that body didn't need to be claimed. It didn't need to be suffered. In fact, that aware consciousness that was as vibrant and clear as ever was not the body, and therefore it didn't have to be connected to the pain, suffering the pain. It was seeing the difference between pain, which is in the body, and suffering. So I want to be very clear that it wasn't so the pain in that body simply ceased. It did not. It continued, and it was as intense and mind-bending as ever. But if I and my body are two different things, then still I don't have to claim it. I don't have to own it. I don't have to tell a story about it. It was, in that moment, the recognition that I wasn't the body, and therefore it was a complete and total release from the suffering that was in that body. And that was after a solid week of blackout, mind-bending levels of pain. That was a level of freedom that is simply difficult to describe, even though we're going to try today. The second recognition that flooded in the moment of that click was very simple. It was simply that the life force in the body that was clearly draining away was draining away relatively slowly, and it was clearly going to take a little while. This was not imminent. I didn't know. There was no clear way of knowing, but clearly it seemed that there would be at least a few days before this body shut down and, before I moved on from this body completely. And what I would emphasize about that was simply that instead of seeming like a trauma or an emergency, like, oh my God, I'm dying, it was met not with that urgency, but with this sense of wonder. Like in that same moment, recognizing that myself and the body are two different things, and that there was this extraordinary freedom in that. Well, the attitude was simply and immediately something more like, wow, this is extraordinary. And clearly I'm going to have the gift of reveling in it for some time. And that is so revelatory and so fascinating to me at this moment, that instead of meeting it with a sense of, oh dear God, I'm dying, it was, wow, I think I'm dying. This is extraordinary. It seems like a funny thing to say out loud. I felt lucky. I felt delighted. I felt so fascinated by the way this was already unfolding that it felt like a gift to know that it was going to unfold for a little while. What I would want to share about it was that sense of individuatedness was dissolving, yes, but it was dissolving in favor of what was not individuated, what was not individual, which was not separate, which was, in other words, that separate sense of self was dissolving into what presents as this overarching, all-encompassing wholeness, unindividuated, total and complete wholeness. Sometimes it's called oneness. And what's curious about that, and sometimes hard for these worldly minds of ours to wrap itself around, is that if something is completely whole and completely one, then it is missing nothing. And if it's missing nothing, absolutely nothing, then there's simply no possibility for there to be a sense of lack, or a sense of want, or a sense of need. And that's exactly how it was experienced. And so instead of being something that seemed fearful, it seemed all-encompassingly whole, without fear in any way. If there is no possibility even of there being a sense of lack or want or need, there really is no way for there to be fear. There's no point. There's no ground for it to stand upon. And so the idea that this death of my own body was a problem or an issue or something that even needed to be solved did not even arise. Where that began to become curiously clear, particularly, was relatively soon after all of this begins unfolding. My father appears in the doorway, and he, for days now, he sort of periodically checked on me. He arrives at this moment, and I cannot fathom how to explain any of this to him. I mean, physically, I could barely speak at that time. So even if I wanted to explain myself to him, it would have been next to impossible. But I knew without any doubt at all that even if I had full capability of my own faculties, there's no way I could have found the words in that moment. What I can say is that there was no impulse to even try. There was no urgency. There was nothing in me that said, hey, Dad, I got to tell you I'm dying. That was irrelevant. It didn't matter. So I did none of those things. Instead, all I could do was simply look back at him. I smiled, and I felt incredibly peaceful and loving, and that is it. And it felt exquisite. It also felt like the only possible way forward, the only one that made any sense at all. There's a wonderful phrase, love is the opposite of fear. The heart of this experience was in part demonstrating that very thing, that if fear is impossible, which it was, then the sort of natural default setting was simply something of a peace that is indeed beyond our usual understanding of what peace can even be. And out of that peace, naturally the default setting is simply something loving. And so that is exactly how I looked at my father and said nothing. When you're in blackout level pain for days and days on end, it may have been difficult to sleep. Indeed, it had been. But at this time, in this case, there was this thought arose like, gosh, I'll bet I could sleep. That would probably be good. Maybe that would be healing for the body. And yes, it had completely changed my internal landscape. And so that night, I actually slept for the first time in days. I would wake up periodically during the night, and every time I woke up, I would check in. Am I still dying? Is that life force still falling away? Yes. Yes, it is. In fact, I can feel every molecule of life force that flows out is equal to that all-encompassing wholeness that feels like it is growing more and more and more and more. That dissolving into that oneness, that allness. And that process is happening faster as well. My body is shutting down a little faster and a little faster. Two things occur the following day, though. One of them surprises me a little bit. It's this thought that arises in my mind that it's sort of like I feel like I have this internal experience of perceiving that ultimate threshold, that sort of final doorway, as it's often called. And this question arises of, well, am I going to go through that doorway or not? And it presents itself very clearly as simply a choice, a very simple choice. There's nothing to it as a choice. There's no sense of there being any effort or difficulty in that choice. There's no sense of there being any requirements like merit of some sort. It's absolutely a simple choice. It's a yes or no. Couldn't be easier. And I think, well, why not? Why wouldn't one go towards the peace that passes all understanding? That would be a reasonable thing to go towards, wouldn't it? It's a question I've always found interesting still. I'd been trying to figure out how to answer that and mostly feeling as though I was failing. And so to be presented with a, yeah, you could go through that doorway or you could stay because there's things you need to do. My immediate question was, all right, fine. What am I supposed to be doing here? I have no idea. And yet that feeling, that impulse is the best way I can describe it, to stay because there was things I needed to do here, was clear and it was strong, but it was also frankly baffling. I didn't really know what it meant. I just knew it was there and it seemed compelling. And to my surprise, instead of going towards the peace that passes all understanding, I was more likely to say, nah, let me pass on that. I think I'm going to stay. I got some stuff to do. I don't know what it is. I guess I'll have to figure that out. And so in a way that was sort of, you might say, karmically perfect, very soon after that exchange of thoughts inside my own head that occurred, my father appears in the doorway yet again. And this time he looks at me different than he has any other time. And he squints his face at me and he looks close and he says, Jonathan, I think something's not right. I think we better load up the car and head back to the hospital. And I think to myself, all right. Because I know immediately that what that means is the fact that I'm dying is going to be reversed. It was very close. It was like 49% go through the doorway, 51% stay. But there was just enough in me saying, yeah, I think you got to stay. That the idea that we would go back to the hospital and go through all of this it just seemed like a well put together. It's a 2-hour drive. It's nowhere close. And we go back to the same hospital that conducted the surgery in the first place. Instead of going to the surgical ward this time, we're in the emergency room. I'm admitted. The doctors very quickly confirmed for my father that my body is dying, and it's dying for the dumbest reason in medical science. It is so dumb. My body is shutting down from dehydration, which makes it a very simple fix. So they plug an IV bag into my arm with saline solution into it, and instantly when that is connected, I can feel that life force begin to flow back in. I can feel the merging with the infinite begin to reverse. And I'm beginning to retreat from that infinite and to put my feet more firmly on the ground here. It is the first point during this journey in which my father has some clear information that I was in fact dying. So he's feeling rather delighted. And they keep me for a few hours to observe. It's fine, everything's fine. There's nothing else to do. Later, we load back up and we simply drive back over to the farmhouse. And I reflect a lot on the car ride back, over the next few days. And I still don't have any idea why I returned, really. Like, what is it that I'm supposed to be doing here? In the end, I spent the next many years unpacking that. And I'm sure that among the reasons I should return is so that you and I could do things like this today, among some others. This near-death experience was a very powerful signpost for me. It reoriented things inside me in such a way that I could not ignore any longer, that I had great questions about the nature of how to be in this world, what to do here, what would motivate me. The first thing I did with this experience was bury it, because I couldn't figure out how it fit this otherwise ordinary life. It seemed like what I knew to be true was the opposite of the way ordinary life here worked, that this body is extremely important, that this sense of individuated self is the only thing that keeps me together. Like that, this entire life spins around the center of that individuated self, doesn't it? Couldn't forget it, but I couldn't figure out how to talk about it. I couldn't figure out how to explain it. Couldn't figure out what to do with it. But it did remain with me in such a way that turned me into a seeker that became absolutely ferocious. And what occurred over the next decade was the appearance of many, many, many additional experiences that came my way. Some of them had to do with death and dying, including the passing of my own father, in which I ended up in the unusual circumstance of being the one that had to give the order to the staff to unhook the machines to let my father die. Those additional experiences over a decade that sort of forced me back into having to contend with my own experience. In the end, 11 years after that NDE, resulted in what is commonly referred to as an awakening or experience. What they really point to in the simplest possible terms is a shift in awareness. It's a shift in perception. And it was going through that shift in perception many years after the NDE in which the truths that I encountered during that NDE felt as though they really settled in a way that was full and permanent. And it was going through that shift that totally reoriented life for me, that reoriented the way I look upon life, think about life, move through life. And at the absolute heart of that shift 11 years later was the settling in of that sense that that individuated sense of self was in fact ultimately a fiction. And if that's a fiction, then that all-encompassing non-individuated awareness is what's left in its wake. And so when that individuated sense of self is seen through, then it's possible then that the baggage that that individuated sense of self carries also is seen through. And so the weight of that baggage is simply much lighter. And the kind of peace that's accessed then becomes so much more full. And when we're acting and meeting the world from that kind of peace, it simply tends to become a kinder, gentler place internally and therefore externally as well. The easiest way to reach out to me, you can write me an email. You're also welcome to download a collection of essays I've written there. Is just to come to my website. There's a website called assistthespirit.com. And there you'll find this ebook full of essays I've written, including the original essay about the near-death experience that does contain a lot of details I haven't shared today. And but there's a bunch of other essays as well that just pertain to spiritual awakening and living in the world in the context of spiritual awakening and things like that. It's available for free. It's just offered as a resource for whomever might find it valuable. There's lots of videos. There's some podcast interviews. And if you want to just write me an email, you can do that too. There's free, I host Zoom gatherings sometimes. There's a retreat coming up in May. There's lots of things to connect on at the website there. So I invite anyone to come check it out. assistthespirit.com.